So before we get super into Revelation chapter 12, the thing we need to understand is that this chapter is written in the chiastic structure. And what that means is that the outer layers of the chapter will correspond to each other, and in the middle of the chapter, it has Satan being cast out. And because that is the middle of the chapter, that actually means that that is the key idea of this chapter. The other thing about having a chapter written in the chiastic structure is that it means that it is not necessarily going to be in chronological order. That's why there's a lot of different interpretations of it. The first symbolism we're going to talk about is the sun, moon, and stars. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." And to help us understand the sun, moon, and stars, I've listed Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 and 10, and those verses say, "Then he," referring to Joseph, "dreamed another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him, and said to him, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" From the verses in Genesis, to me it's pretty clear that the 12 stars were the 12 sons, and that would leave the moon and the sun to be his mother and father. And what this means is that to be clothed with the sun, moon, and stars is to be clothed in Israel. That means that the woman can't really be the church because the church doesn't necessarily match Israel. And it also, to me, suggests that it's not Israel itself, because I don't think you'd be clothed in yourself. Now we're going to read more about the woman. So in Revelation chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "She was pregnant and carrying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth." And then I also pointed out that in Galatians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, "But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother." But what we do know from what we just read is that Jerusalem could be a mother. Jerusalem is a place where a lot of end times activity is expected to take place. And when we read in the Gospels, it talks about there being birth pains during the tribulation period. And that's not talking about a person, it's talking about a larger group of people. And Jerusalem certainly seems to fit the bill. And Jerusalem is definitely clothed in Israel. Next is Revelation chapter 12, verse 3. It says, "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems." And the interesting thing about it is that right now the crowns are on the dragon's head. And this indicates that the power is spiritual. Later, these crowns are going to be on the horns, and that's going to mean something different. But because the dragon's power in the beginning of the tribulation period is spiritual, starting off with false prophets and false Christs trying to mislead people, but it'll turn into more of a physical thing later. Next, we're going to be talking about Satan trying to devour the male child. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, we read that his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. To help understand how the red dragon is going to try to devour the male child, I'm going to read Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that had been ascertained from the wise men." Then why are you talking about Herod and Jesus being born? Well, I suggest that because that's what the passage appears to be talking about. And the reason that I think that John did this, and this is just my opinion, but I think he did that to provide a clean break from what was happening in the previous chapter. Because in Revelation chapter 11, it was talking about the trumpets in seal 7, and by talking about Herod trying to kill Jesus, it shows that this is a clean break from that we're doing a retelling of the same story but from a different perspective. My interpretation of what's going on in these verses is that the red dragon was using Herod to attempt to kill the male child. The next verse is Revelation chapter 13, verse 5. It says, "She gave birth to the male child, so that when she bore her child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne." In Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, it says, "For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." And in Luke chapter 1, verse 35, we see the angel talking to Mary, and what happens is it says, "And the angel answered her, The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God." Now, from these verses, to me, it's pretty clear that the male child is Jesus. Now, some people wanted to claim that this part in Revelation was trying to talk about a rapture of the church, but the church is never referred to as a male, and therefore that really wouldn't make sense. And based on the passages we read, it seems pretty clear to me that this is Jesus. Next, we're going to read about the spiritual war in heaven and with the church. We'll start in heaven, Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 and 8. "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven." And then on the other side of the church, Revelation chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, and it says, "And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O heavens, who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." In the second couple of verses, we saw that the testimony of Jesus was used to defeat the dragon, and that they were willing to give their lives even, and that suggests that it's people being discussed. In Revelation chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, it says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God." That's what I believe is going to be kicking off the end of the first 3.5 years. And 3.5 years in the tribulation period is when I expect the Antichrist to cause the abomination of desolation. But we're going to talk about that in a separate video. In Job chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came from among them. The Lord said to Satan, From where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro on the earth, and walking up and down on it." And the reason I bring up the verses in Job is because we know that Satan is more than capable of sitting down and talking with God up in heaven currently. Because if Satan came from the earth to see God, then he must have left the earth to see God, and therefore it was not on earth. But with this new casting out, this is a more finalized version, a complete casting out. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, it says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. And in Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, it tells us, "And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time." So I don't know if those wings represent the woman getting an airplane ride, getting a ride from an animal, if they're going to have angels help them, or what. What we do know is that they're going to have her be nourished for 3.5 years. In Revelation chapter 12, verses 15 and 16, it says, "The woman poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth." And so again, I don't know if this is a dragon's going to be a literal dragon. I mean, we're told it's Satan, but he is doing something with a river to try to drown the woman, but the earth is stopping it, and that sounds like it could be an earthquake or something like that, possibly, because there are prophecies of earthquakes in the last days, and there are prophecies about them specifically. So we do see that the dragon goes after the woman, which we've discussed as being Jerusalem, first. Then in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, we see, "Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. And things get even more intense from an earthly perspective when we go into the second half of the tribulation period. But I'll have to discuss that in a future video. But if you like this video, be sure to give the video a thumbs up, and I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.